First of all, let's remember that our city is named for a woman, St. Barbara, whose day is December 4th each year. There used to be celebrations and remembrances on this day, but we don't seem to hear much about that anymore. One day that we do still celebrate is Mother's Day. In 1914, President Woodrow Wilson inaugurated Mother's Day and declared that it would be held on the second Sunday of each year. What we wore. Let's move on to the important stuff. So let's start by getting dressed. At the beginning of the 19-teens, women were still wearing corsets, but that was beginning to fade in popularity as dress styles became less form-fitting. Many working women began to wear a black A-line skirt with a loose-fitting blouse. Although a century ago, a blouse was called a waist. It's a little disconcerting to see ads in the newspapers back then announcing a sale on ladies' waists. Here's a sampling of what well-dressed women would wear. You can see why it was not necessary to be wearing a tight-fitting corset underneath. And notice the length of the dresses. A little bit of ankle was now showing. You can understand why the knee-length skirts of the Roaring '20s was so shocking. It might seem strange that I'm including an ad for men's wristwatches in this presentation. I've done it to bring up the topic of wristwatches. Up until World War I, 1914 through 18, women wore wristwatches, but men did not. It was considered effeminate. Men used pocket watches that were often attached with a chain. However, because this was difficult to deal with when soldiers were in the trenches, the military stated that soldiers should wear wristwatches. Now it's time to move on to our shoes. Of course, we wore heels and stockings. The stockings were cotton or silk and usually colored black or white. However, during the 19-teens, some daring women began to forego stockings. And believe it or not, some guys were so shocked and surprised to see naked ankles that they were walking into lampposts. Most women did not shave their legs until the 1920s, when dresses got shorter. A few daring young women began wearing boots with their dresses, but the emphasis was on feminine-looking styles like this. Of course, many women did not leave the house without a hat. In the teens, these were often large hats. Ostrich feathers were popular. It wasn't until the 1920s when close-fitting hats became common. My theory is that as cars got faster, a tight-fitting hat was easier to keep on. On the beach. At the beginning of the teens, most women wore cotton dresses like this. Of course, they waded in the water and splashed around. It would be hard to swim wearing something like this. Here you can see how bathing suits began to evolve in the teens. On the left are the suits that look like dresses. On the right is an example of what these suits were morphing into. Notice in both cases, the women are still wearing stockings. I think that the revolution in women's bathing suits was influenced in large part by actresses who appeared wearing swimsuits in early movies. This actress appeared in several movies produced by Santa Barbara's Flying A studio. She was known for her adventurous roles, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. This is Ida Schnall, a champion swimmer who appeared in some movies made by Santa Barbara's Flying A film studio. She probably would have qualified for the Olympics. In 1912, women were finally allowed to compete in water events for the first time in the Olympics. But the man in charge of the US Olympic team refused to allow US women to compete in swimming events. I'm not sure when that changed. The Olympics were canceled in 1916 because of World War I. Some of these early swimsuits were knitted wool that would get quite heavy when wet. British women who were allowed to compete in the 1912 Olympics in water events wore suits made of knitted silk. Santa Barbara citizens who felt that women should be wearing knee-length dresses with ruffles and lace at the beach were loudly protesting women wearing one-piece knitted suits like this. One police captain here said that the bathing costumes of some girls were scandalous. He said, "They paraded their shapely figures along the beach and the ocean front. To loll on the beach in scant attire is immodest." The police ordered some of the girls off the beach. Finally, the mayor held a meeting about the swimsuit issue, and the city finally decided that the police would not get involved. And off the beach, women were beginning to wear pants for the first time in Santa Barbara. The women in pants issue was related to World War I, as women were encouraged to grow victory gardens. The pants were loose-fitting and cinched at the ankle like harem pants, so that they would not look like men's trousers. The local paper wrote, "This lends a touch of feminism to that which is sure to annul any prejudices that might arise with the mention of overalls for women." Let's get cooking. Now here's something that we can relate to today: grocery stores that deliver. The pandemic has brought about a century-old custom that pretty much faded out until a couple of years ago. Notice that near the bottom of the ad, it mentions that the grocery store delivers. Back in the years when lots of families did not have cars and women did not drive, shopping for groceries and hauling them home would have been a real chore. I'm guessing that the custom of grocery stores delivering faded away in the 1920s when cars became more common. You could also just call the grocery and ask that your order be delivered. We didn't have supermarkets yet, so when you went to the grocery, all of the items were behind the counter, and you had to ask the clerk to hand you a can of peas or corn or whatever. Here's an ad for something called a fireless cooker that was actually an insulated box. You first heated a pot of soup or stew on a coal-fired or gas-fired stove, then placed the pot in this box to let it sit until dinner time. We kind of take it for granted that a kitchen will have built-in cabinets and countertops, but that did not start until the 1920s. In the 19-teens and earlier, storage in kitchens was in wooden cabinets that were freestanding, that is, not attached to the wall. This piece of furniture was a nifty one that doubled as storage and also provided a work surface for food preparation and also had a built-in flour sifter. The first company to make these all-purpose cabinets was located in Indiana, hence the name Hoosier Cabinet. Mondays were laundry days in many homes. Some women still heated pots of water on the stove and scrubbed clothes in a wooden tub. But change was coming as homes began to have electricity. Of course, you still needed to do a lot of the washing and rinsing by hand, and then put the clothes through the wringer before putting them out on the clothesline in the backyard. Or you could have your maid do the work, or you could take your dirty laundry to a professional laundry. One popular laundry business was the Enterprise Laundry on Lower State Street. After washing machines in homes became more common, that business closed and eventually became a restaurant called the Enterprise Fish Company for many years. I believe that has recently closed, but the century-old brick building is still here, so that's how it got its name. Of course, no one walks 7 miles with an iron, but it probably felt like that with the irons that you heated on the stove. You often had 2 irons heating, one to iron with and the other heating on the stove. These irons weighed 7 to 9 pounds. But electricity would change all of this. Here's an ad for the new Hot Point electric iron. It was claimed that it would not soot up your clothes. So apparently, heating irons on the stove could be messy. The big problem was when electricity was added to pre-existing homes, the lights in the ceiling were sometimes the only place where there was electrical wiring, since that was the main use of electricity. So housewives often had to stand on a chair to plug in their electric iron into the light socket. If you remember, some older light sockets have a place to screw in the bulb, but also a place to put in a plug. Electrified coffee makers and toasters were also beginning to make an appearance in homes in Santa Barbara. The stove and the oven had been used before this. Finally, electric outlets were beginning to be placed on walls and baseboards where they would be much more convenient. So many things that we take for granted today, huh? And how many of you have ever used one of these? A human-powered sewing machine. All right, I see a couple of hands. Good group, okay? You rock your feet forward and backward on the treadle at the bottom of the machine to power it. I've actually used one of these too, and you have to keep up a steady rhythm to make it run properly. Movies and the arts. Well, it wasn't all drudgery back then. We did have some fun and interesting things going on in Santa Barbara in the 19-teens. Vaudeville shows were popular here. These were variety shows that traveled around the country, so there was always something new and different to watch. The shows consisted of 5 to 10-minute acts that might be singers, dancers, animal acts, magicians, contortionists, etc. Here's one that was here. A woman was tied to a wheel, held in the air, and rotated 30 times a minute. Vaudeville shows often contained some short movies as well, maybe 5 to 10 minutes long. The vaudeville shows often ran continuously all afternoon and evening, so people could arrive and leave whenever it was convenient for them. As you probably know, Santa Barbara was one of the few cities in California that had a film studio. The American Film Manufacturing Company, nicknamed the Flying A, was here from about 1912 to about 1921. They employed about 1,000 people, and this young lady was one of them. Leontine Bierabent was a film editor. It may seem strange to us today, but it was fairly common for women to work behind the scenes in the movie industry. Women were often the ones who wrote the stories that were used in the movies. The stories were called scenarios. A Santa Barbara writer named Marion Craig Wentworth wrote an anti-war play called War Brides that was produced in New York and later turned into a movie. The play was based on a story that during World War I, the German government encouraged young men to marry and get their wives pregnant before they went off to the war. It may seem surprising to us today, but a number of the roles for actresses in the 19-teens were for adventurous women in the serials called cliffhangers. The Perils of Pauline is the one that most of us know about today, but there were many, many like that. By the 1920s, however, as more and more money poured into the movie industry, men took over more and more of the jobs in the movies. And I think that's why the stars of the adventure movies were mostly men in the 1920s and later. Here's one that I couldn't resist including. This is Gertie, the female dinosaur. She was one of the earliest animated cartoon characters. Inez Dibley was a descendant of the De La Guerra family here in Santa Barbara. She grew up in a mansion on the Mesa, where City College is today. She was a well-known dancer here who danced traditional Spanish dances. Here's another dancer who grew up in Santa Barbara. She must have been someone that they knew would go far. If Santa Barbara High School had had a student most likely to succeed vote in 1913, the year she graduated, she would have been in the running. In addition to being popular, she seemed to be good at so many things: basketball, drama, writing, student council, dancing. Her name was Martha Graham, right? She's from Santa Barbara. Her life was a series of firsts. The first dancer to perform at the White House, the founder of the first American dance company, and the first dancer to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Here's a successful actress in the silent movies who grew up in Santa Barbara but did not perform with the Flying A Studio. She performed with Buster Keaton, who you see here, as well as Laurel and Hardy and Charlie Chaplin. Her name was Blanche Payson. Her uncle had been police chief here in Santa Barbara, and that, plus her height, she was over 6 feet tall, got her a job as a policewoman at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. This fair was held to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. At the fair, she was discovered by Mack Sennett, the director of the Keystone Cops movies. During her 30-year career, Blanche appeared in 158 movies. Another Santa Barbara actress who performed in silent movies in Hollywood was this young lady, Bessie Eiton. She appeared in some 200 films in the 19-teens and 20s. How many streets in Santa Barbara are named for an opera? We don't have a Carmen or a Faust, but we do have Natoma Avenue. This street in the West Beach neighborhood was named for Natoma, an opera written by Victor Herbert in 1911. The opera supposedly portrayed a Chumash woman living in Santa Barbara. One of the most famous ballerinas of the past was Anna Pavlova. She performed at the Potter Theater here in 1916. "The greatest ballerina who ever lived," wrote the local paper. Pavlova also appeared in a silent movie that was filmed in Montecito and Catalina Island in 1915. Both the dessert, called Peaches Melba, and Melba toast are named for this famous opera star named Nellie Melba. She stayed at the Bellasguardo estate here in 1918 for a couple of months. The mansion where she stayed was the first Bellasguardo. The Bellasguardo mansion that is there now is the second one and dates to 1933. This is superstar Mary Miles Minter, nicknamed Little Mary. Still in her teens, when she joined the folks at the Flying A film studio, she was promptly interviewed by a local gossip columnist who gushed that Mary was just the dearest, sweetest little girl you could ever wish to see. What a dear, perfect child she is. Here's another actress from the Flying A, Charlotte Burton. Her fans wrote her so many fan letters that the Santa Barbara post office was raised in its rating. It was said that she received 800 letters a day. Back when women were barely showing their ankles and some young ladies were getting pulled off the beach because their swimsuits were considered too revealing, moviegoers were seeing scenes such as this. The movies filmed on the Channel Islands got away with these skimpy costumes by calling these allegories, a blast to the past with mermaids or ancient Greece. In some of these scenes, the actresses were said to be wearing seaweed and not much else. And then came World War I. World War I broke out in 1914, and the United States joined in 1917. Here is a drawing of a soldier with a woman behind him. This is Miss Columbia, or sometimes called Miss Liberty. At the time, she represented the United States and democracy. That's why she's wearing a Greek-style dress. During the war, she was gradually replaced by Uncle Sam. About the only time that we see Miss Columbia today is at the beginning of Columbia Motion Picture Company movies. Pretty much the same time that the US entered the war in Europe, the Santa Barbara branch of the Red Cross was founded. This was one of the main ways that women could contribute to the war effort. Because of a combination of factors, the food shortages due to farm fields in Europe turned into battlefields, the American farm boys going to the war in Europe, and the US armed forces needing to feed all the soldiers, Americans were urged to conserve food and also to grow their own. Women were important in this field as well. Families were also encouraged to raise chickens. Food scraps that would normally be thrown away could be given to feed the chickens. Sugar was rationed, and even at fancy tea parties in Montecito, guests had to bring their own sugar. And obviously, the sugar shortage made cooking and baking a challenge for homemakers. Oil and flour were also in short supply, so donuts were off the menu at home and in restaurants. As more and more young men left for the battlefields, young women stepped up to take their places in the fields, in the theaters, in the telegraph offices, and in the hotels. The manager of several movie theaters in Santa Barbara announced that he would begin hiring women to be ushers, stagehands, musicians, and motion picture projector operators. Over at the Potter Hotel, young women were beginning to be employed as bellboys and elevator operators. Every woman was knitting socks and sweaters and scarves for the GIs. Women met at the Carrillo Recreation Center and knitted in groups. Others just knitted wherever they were, in a line at the bank, while sitting on the streetcar, etc. At the end of the war, the local Red Cross figured out that we had produced more than 425,000 items that were knitted or sewn, mostly by women or girls, for the war. In other news, women of Santa Barbara were asked to look in their sewing baskets for scraps of fabric to sew into diapers and clothes for babies in Europe. Everyone was encouraged to buy war bonds to help pay for the war. Movie stars such as Flying A's Mary Miles Minter joined parades to publicize the need for help. Women were contributing songs as well. This was a song written by a Santa Barbaran, Imogene Avis Palmer. She wrote both the words and music for this patriotic march song called Cheer as They Pass Along. The local paper said that it was heard on Los Angeles streets and featured in the windows of the leading music houses of that city. You may have heard of the Moody sisters who designed homes here in the 1930s. Well, back in the 19-teens, Mildred Moody, who was an art student at the Normal School on the Riviera, designed a recruitment poster that won a contest. The poster reads, "Even a dog enlists, why not you?" And she won a prize of $25. Santa Barbara women were also in Europe helping the war effort there. Dr. C.C. Park of Montecito and his 2 daughters ran a canteen for soldiers in France that was much appreciated by the fighting men. Nurses were needed in Europe, and some young Santa Barbara women worked there as well. Rose Gandolfo of Santa Barbara was working for the Red Cross in Italy. She had graduated from the Cottage Hospital Nursing School, took a year of postgraduate courses in New York, and then was sent to Italy because she spoke Italian. Another nurse from Santa Barbara was Anna L. Fisher. She served as a Red Cross leader in Damascus, Syria. The war finally ended in November 1918, and in early 1919, the soldiers began coming back. The women of the Santa Barbara Red Cross were at the train station to serve coffee and donuts to the young men returning home, or to those who were on their way to somewhere else but stopping off at our train station. The men were back and they wanted their jobs back. So many women had to return to their former lives. Here's a cartoon from Life magazine, and the caption on it read, "Girls, they're going to demobilize us, and we've got to go back to wearing petticoats and trying to be effeminate." But women's contributions were not forgotten. Women's help during the war led to the winning of the vote in 1920. And so comes to an end one of the most exciting decades for American women and the women of Santa Barbara. As I was writing my Way Back When books, I kept marveling at all the changes that occurred in just a few years. So I pulled out a lot of the women-related items from my book to create this show. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Anybody here going to tell me that's not how I remembered it?
Thank you, Betsy. You know,
All right.
we actually have a handful of those irons downstairs.
Refrigerators back way back then. They had to use the ice. Where was the ice? Was there an ice plant here?
Where did the ice come for ice boxes? The Iceman would come around. Now, good question where it came from. Obviously not Santa Barbara, but somewhere up north. It would be cut in the winter and stored with a lot of straw. I believe there was an ice house on the mesa somewhere. But the Iceman would come around and you would put a sign in the window saying, did you want 10 pounds or 25 pounds or whatever.
I have a question for you. I'm in the kitchen remodeling business, and you're showing some pictures there of when they first introduced the electric toaster and the electric coffee machine. What sort of, about when, what year was that? Do you know, or does anybody know when they first introduced the electric?
Okay.
Compare it with Europe.
Well, the question was, when did electric coffee makers and toasters get introduced? It was during the 1920s, the 19-teens here in Santa Barbara, because that's when we started to get electricity. And that was one of the uses for electricity was convenience. It was good for the lighting. And in fact, they believe that in many towns, once electric lighting came in, more people were reading, and more people were able to have their children read without adult supervision. If you had a gas light going, you did not leave your child in there alone to sit and read. So once electric lights came in, you could let your child read by himself or herself.
One thing I noticed was when you had the Giordano ad up, they said call both numbers 801. And I remember when I was young, and you too, we had 5. I still remember 50843 was my number. And so at that time, there must have been only hundreds that had phones. And,
Yeah, there were phones there. People had phones, but not as many certainly as today. And the numbers were shorter. And then they also, on the numbers I saw, it would say red 501 and black 501. So that was something on the phone. Could you repeat, please?
706 State Street where Giordano's was. What is there now?
706 State Street where Giordano's was. What is there now? Is that a trick question? It's probably been remodeled. Most of State Street has been redone. Although the few things that were built in the 19-teens, there was a Henry Levy shoe store, which I guess rings a bell with some people, but that his building was built or remodeled in the 19-teens. And I have a picture of it in one of my books because it looks pretty much the way that it does today. So that's really cool to see, but so much has changed, and that gosh darn earthquake, so, yeah.
So when I write to people, I always say Santa Barbara is paradise. So when I traveled in Europe, I was marveled that everyone knew California. Wherever I went, California was like a country. And now it seems that Santa Barbara is known all over the world. I wonder in those times you speak about, was Santa Barbara unknown?
That's a good question. When did Santa Barbara sort of become a name? Well, one of the reasons why the Flying A Film Company was welcomed here in Santa Barbara was it was thought that people would watch the movies filmed in Santa Barbara and think, wow, I want to come visit Santa Barbara. Tourism was very important back then. Movie people in general were held in very low regard. A lot of people didn't want movie people in their town. In fact, the Flying A came here in 1912 because they had been in La Mesa near San Diego, and the townspeople did not all like them, and some of the ministers were preaching against them, so they came to a more accepting environment. But I saw many times in the newspapers where people here said, and people will watch the movies filmed in Santa Barbara, and they'll want to come here and see it for themselves. So they were very happy about that. One of the problems got to be that back then, you really didn't, they didn't need permits to do filming. No permits, no problem. Well, they'd go out and drive a car in front of a train as it's pulling into the station, and the train guys would freak out, or they'd send, two actors in the middle of State Street to have a fist fight, and the police would come up and try and stop it, and they go, wait a minute, you're ruining the scene. So that got to be a little bit of a problem. So. Sure.
Is there a fashion trend for the 19teens that you would like to see make a comeback? Or is there one that you're like, oh, thank goodness you don't have to wear that anymore?
Oh, a fashion from the 19teens. The question was, is there a fashion from the 19teens that I'd like to see come back, or one that I'm glad I'm not here? Well, I'm glad we don't have to wear corsets anymore. Gosh, those look really, really uncomfortable.
In the 90s, I had a dress that I'd wear to court, and it looked very much, it was wide, and it got narrow, and kind of about here, and those same kind of sleeves. So it was kind of a 90s.
Yeah, and they also, the skirts could be very narrow. In fact, they were often called hobble skirts, because you kind of walked like this. They weren't popular for very long. Sure. What was the population of Santa Barbara? It was about 20,000 people. In the teens, yeah. I don't think that included Montecito. I'm not sure. Good question. Did that? Right, Montecito was a popular place for the wealthy people, but there were not a lot of them. They were big estates. My next book, which is coming out, is about silent movies that were filmed on the estates in Montecito. And I tried doing research on where are these estates now, and they've all shrunk or been divided, or the mansions are gone or whatever. Yeah, it was not a great population there. It was the people in the big estates, and then the people who were taking care of them. And there was also a little population in what was called Spanish Town. Okay.
Are most of your sources from newspapers, or were there regional magazines, or certain books that you turned to?
Good question. A lot of my sources were the local papers. There were two papers here. There was the Morning Press and the Daily News and Independent. And we were very fortunate that they ran interesting stories. A lot of small town newspapers, all you get is who got married, who died, and it looks like we're going to have a good crop of beans this year. But here in Santa Barbara, somebody there on both papers was writing about someone's monkey got loose and went running down De La Vina Street, and the police captured it with a bag of peanuts, and they found the owner, and it had been used in a Flying A movie, and just really fun stuff like that. Plus, we did have the Flying A film studio here, and the actors were doing all kinds of crazy things. In fact, I'm working on a book called Behind the Scenes at the Flying A, about crazy things that the actors were doing, or stage people, or again, as I said, they didn't tell people where they were going to film, the gangster movie or whatever. So, okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming.